Moraczewski, CEO of NMBL Strategies and a Commercial Receivers Association board member. I'm here today as a part of our Receivership 101 series to talk with you about the costs in a receivership. There are a variety of costs that go into a receivership, and as a plaintiff is considering a receivership, they really need to think through what those costs might be, because ultimately the receivership is funded through the business that it is operating. But if the funds fall short to fund the receivership, most of these costs fall to the plaintiff to fund those costs. So it's a really good idea to understand what those costs might be. Let's take a look at some of the initial costs. Before a receivership is ever filed, plaintiff hires counsel. That counsel obviously comes in as an attorney, and they're going to have hourly costs that are associated with bringing a receivership to fruition. The next cost that also comes in at that time is a counsel for the defendant. The defendant is going to likely be aware that some form of action is going to take place. They may not know that it's a receivership, but they're going to be aware that they're going to have to defend themselves from a plaintiff who is seeking remuneration. After those two costs, a receivership starts to take place. Your initial cost is really always going to be that receiver. That's going to be the largest cost for the receivership, with the receiver as well as counsel for the receiver. It's important to remember, as you've heard from some of our other topics, that the counsel for the receiver should never be the same as the counsel for the plaintiff. Counsel for the receiver has to be acting on behalf of the receiver, who is acting on behalf of the courts. They cannot therefore represent one of the sides, either the plaintiff or the defendant. Above and beyond those initial two individuals, the next piece that typically comes in is a cost for a bond. It is a common practice for bonds to be set as a part of the receivership. Sometimes these are nominal fees that a bond can be paid in cash to the court systems. Other times these are bonds that are taken out through sureties, and it's an opportunity to make sure that the receivership is protected if something were to go wrong. This is, again, something that's going to be a cost of the receivership. While the receiver pulls the bond, the receivership funds the bond. Other things that happen very quickly are notices. Obviously, you have to make notice to anyone else that might be seeking claims against the receivership, that the receivership has taken place. These notices, both through postings as well as mailings, obviously have a cost in money to the receivership. Then you get into some specialties that might go along and may or may not apply to every receivership. Things like taxes. If you are appointed as a general receiver, taxes become a very important part of making sure that the IRS and the state governments are taken care of in an appropriate way to make sure that you're not falling out of line. Again, you're likely hiring an accounting firm to do these taxes, and then also those taxes need to have payments made, and those can sometimes add up to large sums of money. So it's important to make sure that those are taken care of. Other pieces that come in sometimes, logistics, relocating property and equipment back to a more controllable space, especially if you're winding down a business, bringing that under one roof so that you can make sure it's protected and nothing happens to it, either through damage or theft. Then you also might have an auctioneer stepping in, especially again, if you're going into liquidate, you may have to fund an auctioneer that would come in and sell off pieces of the property. Oftentimes this one is done on a percent of the sales basis, so maybe there's not a lot of upfront, if any, upfront costs associated with the receivership. But it's also important to remember that if you sell something for $10,000 and there's a 10% commission, you're not getting $10,000 back into the receivership. You're getting $9,000 back into the receivership. Professional service firms come in and support it, especially in areas where there are questions to how things have been accounted for in the past. You might bring in a forensic accountant. If you're looking at commercial real estate, you might be bringing in a property manager to secure and take care of the property on a regular basis. The receiver may or may not be suitable to be that property manager, and you're oftentimes best engaging professionals that do this on a regular basis to make sure that everything is properly maintained in an appropriate manner. And you also have other specialties. So some of the more common ones coming up a lot lately, cannabis. Cannabis is becoming a more and more common receivership that we're seeing across the country. And a receiver may know the court system and may know how to work through a receivership, but they might not have a history within cannabis. And so they may choose to engage a professional that has operated a cannabis dispensary, that has dealt with state laws that revolve around cannabis. Hotels, you might have to bring in new staffing to support a hotel. You might bring in a hotel management company to actually operate the hotel. And that might be different than the receiver. The receiver may, again, be giving the oversight and making the business decisions, but engaging someone to operate that hotel while you're going on. One of the key things here is to remember that these costs, as they're being incurred as a receiver, need to be in the best interest of the company and the receivership. Meaning, if something is not going to benefit the receivership, it probably should not be a cost of the receivership. And so sometimes you may see equipment loans as a good example. If you see a piece of equipment that you think has a large dollar value to it, but the loan is higher than what you can sell it for, oftentimes the receiver may be best off surrendering the equipment as opposed to trying to sell it and really not gain anything out of it, spending their own time and their money out of the receivership that really has no benefit to the receivership. As you look through all these costs, and there could be other instances where other costs arise, it's really a good idea to understand that these costs go into the receivership, but these are seen as costs that probably are going to be less than if you go through a Chapter 11 or an involuntary bankruptcy. And so it's a good idea to understand these, but also to understand that this still may be your most viable alternative to collections. What are some things that create added costs in a receivership? So how do we minimize these costs? Litigation is the #1 issue that comes about in creating added costs into a receivership. The more times there are filings that are creating new court events, you have that counsel for plaintiff, you have that counsel for defendant, you have the receiver, the counsel for receiver going in again and again and again to defend itself or to defend the company or defend the receivership. Every time that happens, those are added costs that are legitimate costs to the receivership. So minimizing that litigation, and along those same lines, if the receiver has to start calling a lot of depositions, that same principle adds up more and more, where there are incurred costs time and again. Fraud. Obviously, any fraud that's taking place, we mentioned the forensic accountant earlier, but there's going to be a need to consistently protect against fraud. Ultimately, these three things, litigation, depositions, and fraud, all revolve around one thing: plaintiffs and defendants that are uncooperative. If there is cooperation from the plaintiffs and defendants, a lot of times that litigation is minimized, if not eliminated. There becomes less and less need for depositions, and ultimately, hopefully, there's a removal of any occurrence of fraud that maybe has taken place previously prior to the receivership. So if you can have a cooperative environment between the plaintiffs and the defendants, and really the best receivers and the best counsel for receivers, plaintiffs, and defendants are the ones who are not looking to win the fight. They are ultimately looking to find the best possible solution. And when those things happen, you can really start to minimize those costs and make a receivership really push forward in a positive light, so that it can be a really excellent tool for recovering funds or winding down a business or whatever that issue might be. So these are just a few things that you should think about as you're considering a receivership, understanding the costs and what you can do to minimize those costs. We hope this was helpful today. Thank you so much for joining us. And hopefully you look forward to all of our other great sessions.